So, a pair of Air Jordans costs Nike about $28 to $30 to manufacture. The materials, the labor, the factory floor, all of it, roughly 30 bucks. Nike sells that shoe to a retailer for about $50. The retailer puts it on the shelf for 170. And if it's a limited release, the resale market will push it to 300, 500, sometimes over $1,000 for a shoe that started as $30 worth of rubber and thread. Now, somewhere in a city in southeastern China that you have almost certainly never heard of, there is a factory that makes a shoe that looks nearly identical to that Jordan. Same shape, same stitching pattern, same materials in some cases. That factory produces it for about $25, and it sells for $100 to $150 depending on how close to perfect it is. That margin, that gap between what it costs to copy a shoe and what someone will pay for the copy, is the engine of a $500 billion industry. The global counterfeit sneaker market is now estimated to be larger than the legitimate footwear industry itself. Counterfeit footwear makes up roughly 12% of all counterfeit goods on the planet, which makes it the single biggest category of fakes that customs agents pull out of shipping containers year after year. But the operation behind this is nothing like what you'd picture. It has its own factories, its own quality control, its own grading tiers, and a logistics network sophisticated enough to move 22 shipping containers of fake Jordans through the port of New York without anyone noticing until years later. So, how does a $25 factory shoe become a $150 purchase on a platform that guarantees it's real? The answer is a supply chain that mirrors the real one almost perfectly. Think about how a legitimate sneaker gets to your feet. Nike designs the shoe. A contract factory in Asia produces it. The factory loads it into a shipping container. That container crosses the Pacific Ocean, clears customs at the port of Long Beach or Newark, and gets distributed to retailers across the country. The retailer puts it on a shelf. You walk in and buy it. Or, more likely, you buy it online, and it shows up at your door 3 days later. That's the supply chain. Design, produce, ship, distribute, sell. 5 steps, and every single one has real companies with real employees doing real jobs behind it. Sneaker counterfeiting follows the exact same 5 steps, in the exact same order, through many of the same ports, using the same kinds of shipping containers. The only difference between the legitimate supply chain and the counterfeit one is who gave permission. That's it. Everything else, the factory floor, the production line, the quality control process, the cargo ship, the distribution network, the retail platform, it all mirrors the real version step for step. Think of it as a shadow supply chain running parallel to the legitimate one, and the shadow has gotten so sharp that telling the two apart now costs billions of dollars a year just in authentication services. Let me walk you through the shadow version. Step 1 is the design, except counterfeiters don't design anything. They reverse engineer. Someone walks into a store, buys a pair of authentic Air Jordan 1s for $170, brings them back to a workshop, and takes them apart piece by piece. An experienced technician, and these are genuinely experienced people who have been doing this for years, pulls the shoe apart at the seams, measures every dimension, catalogs every material, and draws up a full production spec. In some cases, they don't even need to buy the shoe. There are documented instances of people bribing employees at the legitimate factories to get samples or design drawings before the shoe even hits retail. The blueprint arrives before the real shoe does. Step 2 is production, and this is where it stops looking like a side hustle and starts looking like a real industry. The production center for most of the world's counterfeit sneakers is a city called Putian in China's Fujian province. Putian has over 4,200 shoe companies and roughly 500,000 workers employed in the footwear business. That's not a warehouse district. That's not a few rogue workshops. That's an entire city whose economy runs on making shoes, and a significant portion of those shoes are copies of other people's brands. And the shoes are not all the same quality. This industry has its own grading system, almost like a restaurant rating, where fakes are sorted into tiers based on materials and craftsmanship. At the bottom, you have the cheap ones, the stuff that falls apart in a week and looks wrong to anyone who has ever held a real pair. Above that, there are mid-tier replicas that get the general shape right, but miss details a trained eye would catch. And then, at the top of the ladder, you have what the industry calls unauthorized authentic or god-tier replicas. Shoes built with materials and construction methods so close to the originals that telling them apart requires specialized equipment. The cost to produce a top-tier replica is still under $30. The cost to produce a low-tier knockoff is sometimes under $5. And each tier sells at a different price point, just like any other product line with a budget option, a mid-range option, and a premium offering. Step 3 is shipping. And this is where the operation starts to look less like a factory and more like a logistics company. Counterfeit sneakers leave China two ways. The first way is bulk shipping, 40-foot containers loaded onto cargo vessels bound for major ports. These containers are listed on customs paperwork as ventilation fans or household goods or rubber products, anything that doesn't attract attention. The second way is the small parcel method. Millions of individual packages, each one valued under the customs inspection threshold, shipped directly to buyers through the international mail system. Step 4 is distribution. Once the shoes arrive, they get broken into smaller lots and routed to buyers through middlemen, resale websites, social media storefronts, and sometimes through the authenticated resale platforms themselves. The best counterfeits, the god-tier ones, don't end up on a street corner in Chinatown. They end up in the same marketplace as the real thing, competing for the same buyer at nearly the same price point. And step 5 is the sale. The buyer pays. Sometimes they know what they're buying. Sometimes they genuinely believe they just purchased an authentic pair of limited edition Jordans from a platform that promised to check. Either way, the money flows back through the pipeline, from buyer to middleman to shipper to factory, and the cycle starts again. That's the shadow supply chain. Copy, produce, ship, distribute, sell. Same 5 steps, same infrastructure, same ocean. The only thing that's different is the authorization and the fact that the entire operation, from factory to your doorstep, can be completed for a fraction of what the real one costs. But here's the part of this pipeline that almost nobody talks about: the factory floor itself and what happens there before a single shoe ships. If this is clicking for you, hit subscribe, because we're about to go inside the machine. Putian doesn't look like what you'd expect. You picture counterfeit goods, and you picture a dark warehouse somewhere. Maybe a single room with a few sewing machines and a stack of fake logos. Putian is not that. It is a city of about 3 million people in Fujian province, on the southeastern coast of China, and during the daytime, the shoe district is eerily quiet. Storefronts are closed, streets are empty. The whole area looks like a commercial district that went out of business. Then 9 p.m. hits. There is a part of the city called the Putian Electronic Mall, and as the sun goes down, it comes alive. Traffic jams clog the streets as couriers on motorcycles and in vans pull up to storefronts and workshops to pick up boxes. Business owners meet with middlemen, talk terms, hand over packages. The volume of shoes moving through this area on any given night is staggering, and the whole system runs after dark because that is when the shipping deadlines hit. The boxes need to leave by morning. The operation runs on the same kind of clock that any overnight logistics center runs on. It just happens to be moving counterfeit Jordans instead of Amazon packages. Inside the workshops, the process is more technical than you'd expect. The reverse engineering step, taking apart a real shoe and building a production spec, isn't a casual thing. The people who do this have been in the footwear industry for years, sometimes decades. Many of them used to work in the factories that produced shoes for the legitimate brands. They know the construction techniques because they learned them on the real production lines. So when they take apart an Air Jordan 4 and draw up a spec, they are not guessing. They know which adhesive goes where, they know the tooling for the midsole, they know the weight and texture of the materials that make the shoe feel right in your hand. And then there's the grading. I mentioned the tier system earlier, but it's worth understanding how it actually works, because it tells you everything about how this industry thinks about its own products. At the lowest level, you have what the market calls AAA replicas. These are the $5 to produce shoes. The shape is roughly correct. The logos are there, but the materials are cheap, the glue is visible, and anyone who owns a real pair would spot the fake in a few seconds. These sell for $20 to $40, and they target buyers who know they're buying fakes and just want something that looks close enough from a distance. One tier up, you have super perfect grade. Better materials, cleaner stitching, fewer visible flaws. A casual observer probably wouldn't notice the difference. These cost maybe $15 to $20 to produce and sell for $60 to $100. The buyer here might or might not know what they're getting. And then at the top, you have unauthorized authentic and God tier replicas. These are the ones that use materials nearly identical to what the real factories use. The construction is tight. The weight is right. The box, the tissue paper, the tags, the barcodes, everything is replicated down to the detail. These sell for $100 to $200. And these are the ones that cause real problems, because these are the ones that can pass through authentication systems designed specifically to catch them. The economics of this grading system are fascinating if you think about it for a second. The factory doesn't have to choose one tier and commit to it. A single workshop can produce shoes at every level, adjusting the materials and labor depending on what the buyer orders. The same way a restaurant has dishes at different price points on the same menu. Low tier for the budget market, mid tier for the casual buyer, top tier for the resale market. Each tier has its own margin, and the margin at every level is enormous compared to what it costs to actually make the shoe. What happens after the shoes leave the factory is where the operation stops looking like a small-time hustle and starts looking like a Fortune 500 supply chain. Getting 22 shipping containers of fake Jordans from Putian to a self-storage unit in Brooklyn is not something you improvise. It requires the same kind of logistics infrastructure that legitimate importers use, because it literally runs through the same ports, the same customs checkpoints, and the same freight carriers. The best documented case of how this works is the federal complaint against a man named Qingfu Zheng, a Chinese national who operated under the alias Ray. Zheng ran a counterfeiting network that, over the course of several years, moved an estimated $472 million worth of fake Nike and Louis Vuitton sneakers into the United States. The investigation that eventually caught him began in 2012, and when federal agents finally arrested him at Dulles International Airport, they had tracked at least 22 40-foot shipping containers tied to his operation. Here's how it worked. Zheng and his network set up fictitious company names, registered them with authentic employer identification numbers, the tax IDs that legitimate businesses use to clear customs, and built an entire paper trail designed to make the shipments look routine. The customs paperwork listed the contents as everyday commercial goods. The containers shipped from China into either the Port of New York or the Port of New Jersey, where they cleared customs and were released. From there, the containers were transported to self-storage facilities across Brooklyn, Queens, and Long Island. Inside those units, the shoes were broken into smaller quantities, repackaged, and distributed to wholesalers and retailers. The whole operation ran on burner phones and email addresses disguised to look like they belonged to real companies. Federal investigators actually let 5 of the containers pass through customs on purpose, just to track where they ended up and map the distribution network before making arrests. That's the large-scale method, shipping containers into major ports. But there's a second method that until very recently was arguably even harder to stop, and it exploited a loophole that almost nobody outside of trade law knew about. It's called the Section 321 de minimis exemption, and it works like this. Under U.S. trade law, any package valued at $800 or less could enter the country without formal customs entry. That means no detailed inspection, no duty, no paperwork beyond a basic declaration. The rule was designed for personal gifts and small purchases, things like someone ordering a book from overseas. But it became one of the most exploited pathways for counterfeit goods on the planet, because instead of loading a container with 10,000 pairs of fakes and rolling the dice at a customs checkpoint, a counterfeiter could ship 10,000 individual packages, each one containing a single pair, each one valued at under $800, and each one slipping through under the threshold. The volume of these small shipments was enormous. Millions of de minimis packages entered the United States every year, and customs agents had neither the staffing nor the infrastructure to inspect more than a tiny fraction of them. If you're wondering how that's even legal, so is everyone else. Congress finally suspended the Section 321 exemption for commercial shipments is effective August 2025, closing the loophole after years of pressure from brand owners and enforcement agencies. But even with that loophole closing, the container method still works, and the numbers tell you how much is getting through versus how much is getting caught. In 2024, U.S. Customs seized about $127 million worth of counterfeit footwear. That sounds like a lot until you compare it to a $500 billion industry. The enforcement agencies are catching a fraction of a fraction, and the operations replace themselves faster than the paperwork on the seizure can be filed. What comes next is the part that still doesn't make sense to a lot of people. Because once these shoes land in the United States, some of them don't end up on a street corner or a sketchy website. They end up on platforms that stake their entire business model on the promise that every shoe they sell is real. The obvious victim is Nike, and the numbers back that up. An estimated 10% of all Nike-branded products sold globally are counterfeit. That translates to roughly $3.6 billion a year in lost revenue, money that goes to the counterfeit pipeline instead of to Nike and its authorized retailers. For a company that generates tens of billions in annual revenue, that's not a rounding error. That's an entire product line's worth of sales disappearing into a shadow market every single year. But Nike's losses are only one layer of who pays. The second layer is an entire industry that exists solely because counterfeits are good enough to fool people. Companies like StockX, GOAT, and eBay have all built authentication services, employing teams of specialists whose full-time job is to examine sneakers and determine whether they're real, work that only needs to exist because counterfeit sneakers are now manufactured at a level that regular buyers, and sometimes even experts, cannot distinguish from the real thing. In 2024, StockX reported that it rejected more than 30,000 sneakers suspected of being counterfeit. The total estimated value of those rejected shoes was nearly $10 million. And StockX publishes a number they're proud of, a 99.95% authentication accuracy rate. That sounds almost perfect. And in a lot of contexts, 99.95% would be outstanding. But here's where the math turns uncomfortable. StockX processes millions of transactions a year. If even 0.05% of those are wrong, you're looking at thousands of counterfeit sneakers passing through authentication centers annually, being certified as real, sold at real prices, and delivered to buyers who have no idea. And StockX is just one platform. GOAT has its own authentication pipeline. eBay launched its own authenticity guarantee program. Each of these services catches the vast majority of fakes, but the vast majority is not all of them. And the difference between almost all and all is a gap that real people fall into. People who paid $300, $400, $500 for a shoe because a platform they trusted told them it was genuine. This is the part of the counterfeiting economy that nobody thinks about when they picture a guy selling knockoffs out of a van. The buyer in that scenario knows the risk. They're making a conscious decision to pay $40 for something that would normally cost $170, and they understand the trade-off. The buyer on an authenticated platform does not understand the trade-off because they were told there isn't one. They did everything right. They went to the platform that promises to verify. They paid the premium. They waited for the authentication email that says your shoes have been inspected and verified. And they still ended up with a fake because the fakes have gotten good enough that a trained authenticator with specialized equipment and machine learning tools missed it. And there's a third layer of cost that's even harder to measure. The entire resale sneaker market, which is worth billions on its own, depends on trust. The moment buyers start questioning whether any platform can truly guarantee authenticity, the whole market contracts. Prices drop, volume drops. Sellers who deal exclusively in real shoes get undercut by sellers who don't, and the honest operators can't compete on price against someone whose product costs a tenth of the retail floor. Counterfeiting doesn't just steal from Nike. It poisons the marketplace that legitimate resellers depend on. The cost runs in every direction. Nike loses revenue. The platforms spend millions building and staffing authentication systems. The buyers pay real money for goods that may not be real. And the counterfeiters keep producing and selling for multiples of the manufacturing cost, because every layer of defense built against them is a layer they've already figured out how to get past. So, Nike is losing billions, buyers are getting burned, authentication platforms are spending millions trying to keep up. And the legal system? It's trying. But the scoreboard isn't pretty. Nike has not been sitting still. They have launched legal campaigns that, on paper, look aggressive. The company filed lawsuits against dozens of alleged counterfeit networks operating through websites and social media accounts selling fake shoes. They sued StockX for allegedly allowing counterfeit shoes through its authentication process, and a court ruled that StockX was indeed liable for letting fakes through. That's a major resale platform being held legally responsible for selling counterfeits, which sends a message to every platform in the space. And then there's the case that might end up being the most important one. Not because of the dollar amount, but because of what the jury decided about how far trademark protection actually reaches. In 2024, a federal jury in Los Angeles awarded Nike $11 million against a fashion influencer named Nicholas Tuinenberg, who ran a brand called Divide the Youth. Tuinenberg had been selling counterfeit sneakers through social media, but before he sold them, he removed the Nike logos from the shoes. His argument was essentially that if you take the swoosh off, it's not a Nike product anymore. The jury disagreed. They found that even without the logo, the shoe's overall design, what the law calls trade dress, the shape, the proportions, the colorways, still belonged to Nike. That verdict established something that hadn't been tested at this scale before. You can be found guilty of counterfeiting even if you strip the branding. The design itself is the trademark. For one influencer selling fakes on social media, that's a life-altering judgment. But step back and look at the bigger picture for a second, because this is where the math stops working in Nike's favor. Nike wins an $11 million verdict. That's a headline. But the counterfeit sneaker market generates an estimated $500 billion a year, US. Customs seizes about $127 million worth of fake footwear annually. And that number has grown over the past decade. But the industry has grown even faster. The enforcement is a bucket, and the problem is an ocean. Every time a network gets shut down, the production capacity that generated it still exists in Putian. The factories are still running. The workers still have the skills. The shipping lanes are still open. Even the Section 321 suspension, the closure of the small parcel loophole that took effect in August 2025, only addresses one delivery method. The container shipments, the kind that moved $472 million in fakes through the Zheng Ring, still use the same ports and the same customs infrastructure. And that's the fundamental problem with enforcement. None of it changes the basic economics. The infrastructure to produce and ship these shoes sits in a city of 3 million people whose economy depends on it, and no verdict or seizure dismantles that. And here's where this story takes a turn nobody expects. The obvious question is, where did all these factories come from? Who trained 500,000 workers to make shoes this good? The answer is the same companies losing billions to them right now. If you've made it this far, you're going to want to hear the rest of this. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Putian didn't wake up one morning and decide to start counterfeiting sneakers. The city was taught how to make them by the brands themselves. For decades, Putian was a contract manufacturing hub for international athletic shoe companies, including Nike. This is where real Nikes were actually produced. The factories were built to Nike's specifications. The workers were trained on Nike's production methods. The supply chains for rubber, leather, textiles, adhesives, all of it, were established to serve Nike and companies like it. The entire footwear infrastructure of this city was built around producing legitimate branded shoes for the global market. And then the economics shifted. Labor costs in China began rising. Nike and other brands started moving production to Vietnam and Indonesia, where wages were lower and the margins were better. By the mid-2010s, production had shifted heavily toward Vietnam and Indonesia, with China's share declining year over year. The production contracts moved. The brands moved. The orders moved. But the infrastructure did not move. The factories were still there. The skilled workers, people who had spent years or decades learning exactly how to construct an Air Jordan to specification, they were still there. The material suppliers, the logistics companies, the entire ecosystem that had been built to serve the legitimate shoe industry, all of it stayed in Putian. And when the authorized work dried up, that ecosystem didn't disappear. It pivoted. Nike's decision to move production to cheaper countries seemed like a straightforward cost-cutting play. It was the kind of decision that looks clean on a quarterly earnings slide. But the consequence was that it left behind an entire city full of people who knew exactly how to build Nike shoes, right down to the adhesive patterns and the midsole tooling, and who no longer had a contract to build them legitimately. The expertise didn't follow Nike to Vietnam. It stayed, and it found a new customer. There's a line from an intellectual property blog that captured this better than anyone. The shoes are original. It's just the brands that are fake. That's not quite right legally, but it's closer to the truth than anyone in the industry wants to admit. The same hands that built real Nikes are now building the counterfeits. The same machines, in some cases. The same skills, absolutely. And the quality of the counterfeits is the proof that the training worked. The brands just lost control of where that training went. This is why the counterfeiting problem doesn't respond to lawsuits and seizures the way Nike wants it to. You're not fighting a criminal enterprise that sprang up out of nowhere. You're fighting a workforce you created, using skills you taught, in factories you helped build, making the exact products you showed them how to make. That's not a problem you can litigate away. The lawsuits and seizures add up, but they do not change the underlying fact that an entire city's workforce was trained by the brands themselves, and that workforce now operates independently. Putian is reportedly at a critical stage of transitioning from imitation manufacturing to independent branding, with some factories trying to create and sell their own legitimate shoe brands. But the counterfeit market is still far more profitable than building a brand from scratch, and the skills transfer perfectly. As long as there is a city full of people who know how to build a shoe that retails for multiples of its production cost, the shadow supply chain will have both the motive and the means. The brands didn't just fail to prevent counterfeiting, they built the factory floor it runs on. So that's how sneaker counterfeiters make money. It starts with a $30 shoe and a $170 price tag. And the gap between those two numbers built an industry that now outpaces the legitimate one in total volume. The brands designed the shoes. Their own factories trained the workers. The global shipping system carries the product. And the internet built the marketplace where a top-tier fake can sit right next to the real thing on a platform that swears both are genuine. $500 million in fakes seized at customs every year, and the industry barely flinches, because what gets caught is a rounding error next to what gets through. An $11 million verdict against one influencer, and 10,000 more sellers are already up and running on the same platforms by the time the ink dries. The harder question is whether an industry built on that kind of margin was ever going to avoid creating its own shadow. The margin created the incentive, the brands built the infrastructure, and a market that rewards scarcity and hype supplied the demand. All of it was in place before the first counterfeit shoe left the factory. Tell me what you think in the comments, and if you want to see how this same pattern plays out in other industries, subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.